So my name is Melanie Griffin, and I'm loud today. I'm a longtime attender here at Cedar Ridge, and we're in a series called Stories of Hope, where a few of us are sharing our personal stories. I'm not quite sure how I got stuck with finding hope in loss and grief and death, but as I think of it, since Matthew's been here at Cedar Ridge, I've lost 11 friends to death, and my mother and my brother. So I see why he associates me with the topic. And I'm still standing, here I am, so there must be hope, right? Some of you know my story and have walked through it with me, but if you don't, okay, it's not going to work looking at you. If you don't, you may have seen me crying over the years. I'm like an off-the-charts feeler on the personality types. So I cry easily. So bear with me today. I think I can get through it without melting down. I have tissues. So this is a hard story too, because it doesn't really have a resolution. And stories are supposed to have resolutions, right? They're supposed to have a nice narrative arc with a beginning and a middle and especially a good ending. But anybody who has experienced major loss can tell you that the journey of grief never ends. There really isn't any ending. You don't get over it. You get through it, and it gets easier, but there's no end of it. Grief and loss are incorporated into who we are. They become part of our beings and in our whole life story. And we learn things from the journey of grief if we're open to it. We are forever transformed by grief. And Cedar Ridge is a community of hope and transformation, and that's the first line of our vision statement. I didn't check, but I think it's the first one. And, but in my experience, there's no better agent of transformation than grief and loss. I don't like it that way, but I found it to be true. So that's what I want to talk about is transformation. I'm going to talk mostly about losing a loved one to death because that's my experience, but I know folks in this congregation who have lost jobs, businesses, homes, marriages, friendships, even a beloved pet, mental health, physical health. So I hope that at least some of my story will resonate and translate for people who've experienced personal loss. And these stories of hope aren't about rose-colored glasses or fairy tales. As Matthew said a couple weeks ago, sometimes finding hope is just about persevering and continuing to look for light in the darkness, about refusing to despair or become cynical. And for the most part, I've been doing okay with that. So I just want to share some of the lessons I've learned, and I hope that they will give you hope too. But I have to back up and tell my story before I can get to the hope part. As I've said, I've had a lot of loss in recent years. In addition to the physical deaths, I've had a couple of close friendships that were broken, and that's unusual for me, so it's particularly jarring, especially at times like this. But of course, the biggest whammies were my mom and my brother. So my mom, whom some of you met, she used to come to a Christmas Eve service. She passed away in 2008, and she had dementia for the last years of her life, probably 15 years. And so in a way, it felt like I lost my mom twice. You know, I lost a mom. I see some people nodding. I lost a mom that gave me advice and all. And so I grieved both moms when she passed, the one who took care of me and the one that I took care of. I grieved her very deeply, but I think that my loss was either complicated or interrupted, God forbid postponed, by what happened after her passing. My older brother, Biff, was extremely close to Mom. He lived with her and was her primary caregiver for about 12 years. They were kind of like one organism, you know. If you know the term codependent, that was it. And it was not healthy, as you will see. After Mom died, Biff fell into a deep clinical depression, a lot of anxiety. He had severe post-traumatic stress disorder that was related to some major unresolved losses earlier in his life that he didn't process. So that's my first lesson. You really need to honor your grief and give it its time, or it will come back to get you. And it got him. So over the next 6 years after Mom died, until Biff died this past December, he descended into a hell on earth that I still have not fully absorbed. He went, I'm gonna be okay. He went from a guy who wore ascots and white silk ties and carried a little lint roller in his vest pocket, to a guy who stopped shaving, didn't shower for months, and lived in his pajamas and his slippers. He went from a guy who was obsessively neat and organized to a hoarder who lived in a house overrun with mice and spattered with cat vomit that he could not or would not clean up. When I could manage to coax him outside, he was afraid of the tree branches and the birds. He would cower. It was horrible, and his arms were all bruised from banging the walls in his anxiety and misery. And he would dissolve into tears, gut-wrenching sobs, just about every time I was over there or talked to him on the phone, especially if I suggested that there might be something he could do about his situation. He was in full victim mode. And he'd always been the capable one, the one who did the family finances. He helped me with my taxes. He dealt with lawyers, and now he couldn't even write a check to pay the electric bill. I had to go over there and pay the bills for him. But he refused help. I tried everything. I had a neighbor psychiatrist come over and give him different kinds of antidepressants, which I'm sure was highly illegal. I won't use her name. But he would try them for a week or two and then abandon them. I tried to get him in support groups. I bought him books and supplements. Matthew came over a number of times. Our former pastor, Patsy, called him and went over there. I finally found him a grief counselor who he talked to for the rest of his life for 3 hours a week on the phone and in person at first. But I couldn't save him. His mental stress resulted in heart failure. And even then, he refused medical help. The longer he was isolated, the less reasonable he became, and we argued all the time about his diagnosis and the fact that he needed surgery, but he wouldn't get it. So he was in complete denial, and he didn't trust doctors. This put on over 100 pounds of fluid weight from the heart failure, and he went to the hospital and had it drained off. And he put on another 100 pounds, went back to the hospital. He wouldn't take his medications, and had it drained off again, and continued to refuse surgery and medications. And then he died in the hospital of multiple organ failure on December 23rd. So that's what happened. A lot more happened, obviously, over the 6 years that he descended into that mental illness and heart failure and death. But that's the summary. So Biff was my closest friend. He's the one who looked after me my whole life, like no matter what job I had, no matter where I lived, no matter what relationship I was in. He was the constant. He was always there until he wasn't. And I remember standing at the side of his hospital bed. I was draped over his body, and I was wailing and raging and screaming. And then suddenly the ground just opened up under my feet, like you read about. I was just suspended and standing on nothing. And I was clinging to his body so it wouldn't fall into the abyss that was under my feet. And I was fairly sure I was dying, and that was okay, because I didn't want to be here without him, and I wanted to go with him. And then two things happened. First, I went into shock. And it's really true that God doesn't give us more than we can handle, because he created our bodies to protect us from that kind of trauma. There's a natural shield, and all these brain chemicals, just went to work and separated me from that situation and from my anguish, like I was someone else. And I remember feeling at that moment in the hospital just this profound relief and gratitude that God created the state of shock. Even then, I knew it was a gift. And then, a song started in my head. Great is thy faithfulness, which we sang last week, and we're going to sing it again today. It was never one of my favorites, but it is now. And that song started in the hospital, and it was in my head for weeks. Just a little snippet of it, over and over. All that I needed thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Over and over and over. So at the same time, I felt really angry. I was really angry at the situation, angry at my brother, angry at the doctors who had given him the test that killed him, and angry at God. I thought that I was going to have a few months with him in a nursing home, but they performed a test and he died. But still, even in that anger, I knew that God was providing for me. And I felt accompanied. I had that moment of existential aloneness standing by his bed, and when my closest human relationship was just gone, just torn away, and the earth opened up. And then, thank you, getting a little soggy. And then God's hand just caught me as I was standing on nothing and placed me in this bubble of shock, this little protective bubble of shock with music. And that night, I went over to the house where my brother and my mother had lived. And I broke the news to his cat, Miranda. And I gave her something to eat. And then I ran upstairs and I grabbed about a dozen of my mom's journals in case the house burned down. That's where my head was, like, yeah, full-on dread, as if the house would burn down the same day that my brother died. Later at home in bed that night, I flipped open one of Mom's journals, just randomly. And it opened to the day that her older brother had died in 1984. And on that page, she had written the exact same words that I had written in my journal that night before I got in bed. My beloved big brother is gone. I just felt profound gratitude that God took the time to arrange that sign of accompaniment for me. And I felt accompanied by both God and my mom's spirit, A couple days after Christmas, a couple days after that, the day after Christmas, I went to identify Biff's body and say goodbye before they closed the casket. And I asked Biff to give me signs. He was always big on signs. And I told him I needed to know that he was okay. Because I spent, a lot of years trying to make sure he was okay. And then that night, after the visitation at the funeral home, I was driving home on the Beltway, and this humongous shooting star, huge, just split the sky right down at the horizon, right in front of my car. And, you can't see stars on the Beltway, right? And then the next day, at Biff's funeral, an old friend of ours described Biff as a brilliant shooting star, and I hadn't told him about the star. So those things might sound silly to you, or like coincidences or whatever, but there were others too. I'm not even going to tell you about the wild geese. But to me, they were really gifts of hope from God, and I knew without a doubt that Biff was okay, and that God was with me. I used to be annoyed at what seemed like that trite phrase, oh, God is with you in your suffering. Well, if God's there, why isn't God doing something about this? But now I get it. The knowledge of God's presence was all that I had. And Psalm 35 captures it for me. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. God is close to the brokenhearted, especially close to the brokenhearted. God gets grief because grief comes from love and from our desire for connection, and that comes from God. We wouldn't grieve if we didn't love, and that comes from the heart of God. Jesus was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. The prophet Isaiah tells us, and he wept with sadness over his beloved Jerusalem. He wept with others when they were bereaved. He knew betrayal, he knew rejection, he knew the pain of being misunderstood by his best friends who wouldn't even stay awake with him on the eve of his death. Jesus knew loss, and God knows grief and is close to us when we grieve. I'm not saying things were wonderful because I felt God's presence. They were not. Any of you who's been around me the last year know it's been a really hard year, and I've struggled a lot with anxiety, even though the worst has happened. But I am saying that by being shattered and by losing what I was most attached to on the earth, I became much, much closer to God when I had to let go of my human attachment. And I lost any doubt that I might have had about God's personal love for me. God knows me and knows what I need. You know, down to the journal. And I want to share a scripture with you that kind of echoes my experience during those early days. It's from Lamentations, which is about the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. Tradition has it that Jeremiah wrote Lamentations. It's a dreadful read, really, all about death and destruction and starving mothers and cannibalism. But in the midst of all that, Jeremiah finds hope in God's great faithfulness. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them. And my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. He remembers his bitterness and affliction, and he is downcast. He's not in denial. He's not sweeping anything under the rug. And yet he intentionally turns his mind to God's provision. Yet this I call to mind. It's a purposeful choice he makes. And because he makes that choice, he says, of calling God's faithfulness to mind, he has hope. And here's what he calls to mind. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust. There may yet be hope. So Jeremiah emphasizes drawing aside here, sitting quietly, waiting on God. Let him sit alone in silence. He doesn't say run around and get busy when you're grieving, like a lot of people do. I think he's saying it's good to let the loss sink in, like the Jewish tradition of sitting Shiva when you have friends and you spend 7 days in your house and people come and visit you and you reflect on your loss. He even says it's good for a person to bear the yoke of grief while young. And I think that's because it helps us grow up. It helps us focus on what's important and get a new perspective no matter how old we are. And here at Cedar Ridge, we talk about spending time alone with God and centering on God and practices that can help us do that, contemplative prayer and reflection. And this coming Saturday on the 22nd, we're having an Advent quiet day in the barn. And everyone's invited. There's information in your bulletin, so it'd be a nice early Christmas present to yourself to spend a little time thinking about the meaning of the season. It'll just be simple, a little bit of programs, some food for thought, and lots of time for prayer and silence. So I hope you'll come to that. Whether we're mourning or not, sitting alone in silence with God and prayer and meditation changes our perspective dramatically, and it transforms who we are. When we lose someone or something that we love deeply, it goes beyond transformation. It can feel like we're on a different planet, like we're just standing in another place than where we used to stand. We're a different person. We talk about losing a loved one to death or mental illness or misunderstanding or an affair, but it's not really the loved one who's lost, it's us. It's us who get lost. Biff and Mom are home now. I'm the one who's been wandering around this new world trying to figure out who I am and what I'm supposed to be doing if I'm not a daughter and a baby sister. I'm the lost one. So it's good to spend time sitting with God and processing that. In being lost, we have the opportunity to find ourselves anew, to find our true selves. We're never going to get back to the old normal. This is something I learned in my grief support group. I see people nodding again. And, that's what I was waiting for. When will I be back to normal? Well, you don't get back to normal. You're different. And it's a chance to strip away all the extraneous layers and get down to the core of who you are. Our true feelings are right at the surface. And all the facades and the defenses are gone. So if we choose to, we can be more authentic with ourselves and with other people. About who we are, and about what we need, and about who we want to spend time with, and how we want to spend our time. This is my only preaching moment. How we spend our time. Did you know that the average American spends more than 4 hours a day watching television? That's 2 months a year. So at 65, the average American will have spent 9 years in front of the TV. When you die, will you wish that you had watched more television? When my mom died, I got rid of my television. It just depressed me horribly. Everything on there was just like, boom. So I got rid of it. And I also left my career after 27 years. So you have to be careful. You never know what the real you will do when you start getting in touch with your real desires. But life is short. So why not be totally real and true to who you want to be? Do you remember how it was after September 11th? People were so real and so honest with each other and open. That grief just broke open our shells. And as they say, that's how the light gets in, through the cracks in our shells. So when you allow the light to get in and get closer to your true self, you're giving a gift not just to yourself, but to other people. Our Cedar Ridge vision statement calls us to authentic community. And I think that being real about our grief is a big part of that. When someone asks me how I am now, I tell them. And they might not ask me again. They're not into the authenticity thing. But I want them to know, and I want to know how they are really. Healthy grieving involves being our naked selves before God, but it also involves being vulnerable and exposing ourselves and our neediness in community. I think more than anything, it was isolation that killed Biff. Most people will tell you that community is usually what gets you through the darkest times. God cares for us through community. And you all have truly proven that to me over the past few years. I want to point out, too, that it's the small kindnesses that have kept me going and given me hope. That I'm going to get through this time without imploding like Biff did. Sometimes we can feel like we don't know what to do or say when someone's grieving, or even we want to step away from the person because you don't know how to fill that void, and you can't fill that void. It's the little things you do that make you feel that someone cares. And that's what's important. Simple things, like Jesus talked about simple things, like finding God in mustard seeds and chunks of bread and tiny coins. Little things. Debbie Qualls knew that I always visited my brother on Sundays. And she asked me that first Sunday if I had plans. And I said I didn't. Well, she had other plans, but she went and recruited Jonathan and Darren to take me to lunch so that I wouldn't be alone on my first Sunday without Biff. It was just a little thing. She doesn't even remember it, but I sure do. And one day I was feeling sorry for myself on a rainy day, and I wrote a silly post on Facebook, something like, I'm sad, I need flowers and chocolate, and maybe some Swiss cheese. And the next day, this huge bouquet of flowers arrived at my front door. And it was sent by Jamie Hermanson. And are you here, Jamie? And she and I weren't real close. We're not good friends, don't know each other real well, but we prayed together a number of times when her mother died in a tragic accident a couple of years ago. So she knew what it meant to feel alone on a rainy day, and she put her compassion into action. One day, I melted down while grocery shopping after church, because I always shop for Biff on Sundays, and everything in the store reminded me of him. Does that happen to you? Like, grocery stores are the worst place for any kind of loss. Or maybe it's just my focus on food, but anyway. But I went, I was just, again, it was pouring rain, and I was sitting in the car in the parking lot just sobbing, and I went over to Bill Duncan's, poor fella. And he's my neighbor, and I just sobbed. I blubbered all over his shoulder as soon as he opened the door. And he said, what happened? What happened? Did something happen? And I said, no, it's Sunday and I went grocery shopping. Like, what was he supposed to do with that? And Bill is not a feeler, if you know Bill. So, but you know what he did? He made me chamomile tea. And we chatted for about an hour, and I was okay. Just a little thing, but it was a huge thing. And one night, I went to a movie and I went to this Osage County. I know! And I just met my family was alcoholic. My dad was an alcoholic too. It was bad. It was a good movie though. But anyway, I just melted down in the parking lot afterwards. And I called Bill Smith, who was also a neighbor, and he invited me over, and we sat there for hours. I don't even know how long, hours and hours, just laughing and crying and talking about life and death. And I think Bill is a feeler. Hope Dolan has kind of adopted me, and she's had me over with meals for her family. She says it means a lot to them to have me there since her husband Mark passed away in September. But of course, it means the world to me to be around a family table when I don't have family. By the way, are you here, Hope? If you ever want to know about finding light in darkness or hope in dark situations, you should check with Hope. She's amazing. She has had a lot of loss in her life, and she knows she's well named. So as we grieve and comfort each other, we share the heart of God. 2 Corinthians says it this way: Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. So we're not always going to get a huge shooting star, but if we're looking for the divine, we will find it in a well-timed card or call, or a bouquet of flowers, or a cup of chamomile tea. God will comfort us through small things. If we're mindful and we turn our minds to it, the way Jeremiah said, we'll feel less alone. Of course, in the end, we are alone. It's just God and us. But we're all connected. We come into the world connected to our mothers, and we go through this world connected to each other through the Holy Spirit, and we all leave this world holding the hand of Jesus. We're all on one journey together, the journey of becoming more loving. That's our task here. And loss has surely helped me become more loving. I learned to love my mom with her dementia, even though it was hard because I was mad at her too. She left. It's like, where are you? You can get over this. But I learned to love her that way. And I learned compassion and patience. It's funny because a few years ago in my journal, my goal for the year, I was looking at the fruits of the Spirit. It's like patience. I want to work on patience. Never say that. But I did learn patience and compassion and deep, deep, deep love for Biff, even though I didn't understand. And I was so angry at him and so afraid that he would die. And he did. He died. But that's not the end of the story. And it wasn't the end of the story when Jesus was crucified either. This became very clear to me when our dear friend Betsy Mitchell-Henning passed away, just a few weeks after Biff. With a spirit as lively and loving as hers, we all said, can't imagine the world without Betsy, right? Remember that? Everybody said that. The world without Betsy, can't imagine it. And there's a reason for that. It's because Betsy's spirit is still alive. I felt it in here at her service, alive as ever in the world. The unconditional love that she radiated out to us, we absorbed, and now we radiate it out to each other. And we radiate it back to the world. Her spirit is alive, and her love is alive in us. It's God's love. And because I could believe this about Betsy, I decided to take a risk. I told God that I was ready to welcome Biff's spirit into my life, and that I wanted us to have a continuing relationship, even though it would mean more pain, because I would be remembering him and thinking of him instead of just needing to close the door and move on. I wanted a continuing relationship, and I wanted a living spiritual connection with him. I didn't want to be without him. I wanted to open myself to his presence and believe that he was accompanying me. And then, as I was writing this prayer in my journal, I realized this is exactly what Jesus offers us. Exactly. He asks us to accept his own loving spirit and to risk believing that he's with us and that he will accompany us and live with us. Opening to Jesus' eternal loving spirit does mean more pain, because Jesus softens our heart to the world's pain, and we share his grief and deep sadness about the brokenness and grief in the world. And that spirit also convicts us of our own brokenness, and that's humbling and painful sometimes. But the pain encourages growth, and it makes us more loving and compassionate people. And that's what this journey is all about, learning love. There's no greater joy and no higher hope than being one with that eternal spirit of love. It's a mystery. It's beyond our understanding. But I think in times of great loss and grief, we're in this liminal space, thin space, where the space between this reality and the beyond or the mystery is thinner, and we can see through that veil a little bit better. I heard someone say once that we should be good stewards of our grief. And I thought that was weird because that makes grief sound like it's some kind of gift, or a resource. And I haven't fully embraced that, at least not yet. Working on this sermon moving me that direction. But I do know that grief is not all bad. It breaks us open, yes, but then the light can get in. And we get lost, yeah, but then we find our truer selves. We lose our footing and the ground opens up. But then we step up to a higher plane where we have a different perspective, and I think that's more of God's perspective. We become vulnerable and raw, but then we're open to receiving comfort through others. So there is hope in grief, and life does shine in times of great loss. In Psalm 139, David writes to God, "If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light become night around me. Even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. It's a mystery, but we get glimpses. So that's my story. Thank you for walking the journey with me. And I have an invitation to a further journey. If you want to be a good steward of your grief, we are having a small grief gathering. I don't know what we're calling it, workshop, I guess, but we're not going to work. But everyone's invited, no matter what your loss has been or when it occurred, because the holidays can be hard. So we're just going to have some quiet conversation and talk about some coping skills and strategies for getting through the holidays. And I'm hoping that if I give, of course, Biff died at Christmas, so it's going to be tough anyway, but I'm hoping that if I give my grief the attention that it deserves, that it's not going to come back and surprise me. And so I think it's a good thing. I hope you'll join me for that, and it's in your bulletin too. I want to leave you with a poem that I wrote last winter after Biff passed. It's a photo collage poem, and it's called A Healing Walk. My world is muted, not colorless, as many mourners report. All brown and gray and silky white, gentle colors. There are patterns and intricacies visible only in winter, when life has seemingly stopped. There are reflections of life in the muddy water, and tiny buds despite the thorns. I'm walking through a long, bare tunnel. The cold air echoes in the emptiness. As I emerge from the darkness, a surprised robin surprises me. He's here early. He tilts his head towards me, all attention, as if I'm a worm underground, which he decides I'm not. He flits from branch to branch before flying off, beckoning me to follow his melodious call of spring. Let's pray. God of all comfort, thank you for using everything for good. Thank you that you accompany us in our times of loss and sorrow, and that your eternal living spirit binds us together and teaches us how to love. Give us the courage to love more fully, even at the risk of more painful loss. In the name of your Son, Jesus, who gave his all so that we could live life to the full and experience everything in the light of love. Amen.